three types of real tensions that we're seeing in society. So one is the ecological divide, the second is the social divide, and the third is the spiritual divide. And I don't need to talk about all the kind of problems within that, but just to give a sense on the ecological. So one of us was talking about clean water, the globals. And I mentioned this yesterday. Who knows something about California, the state of California? So it's a pretty wealthy, big state. I think it's the 8th largest economy in the world, just the state of California. And there's been a drought for 2 years, and there are towns in California that have no water. So if you want to take a shower, you have to go to a local police station, and they have set up shower facilities for you to go, and they brought water in for you to be able to take a shower, which I think for most Californians and most Americans, that's just amazing that you could have a complete shortage of water in towns where everything seems so plentiful. And if that's the case in California, you can sort of imagine what could potentially come for our global society. I know there's a bit of concern about a drought here now too. We've been talking about that with some of the local folks. And so just fast forward, if we keep in the direction that we're going in, then probably the next war will be over water. And that's pretty scary to think about. So one other, I think, example of sort of this strong divide that we're seeing is in our financial industry. So the total amount of economic output globally last year was around $20 trillion. But the amount of foreign exchange last year was somewhere on the order of about 700 times that. So 1.4 quadrillion, which is about 1,400 trillion. So you have output of goods and services of 20 trillion, but foreign exchange of 1.4 quadrillion. So clearly there's this tension of the flow of money and the actual value that's tied to it. And as you all know, we've had the housing bubble in the US, which crashed. We've had bubbles in Europe as well. And so what economists are seeing is that this is going to be growing in terms of the size of these types of financial meltdowns. Okay, so we don't need to get totally depressed about everything happening, but I think it's useful to see from a historical perspective some of the massive changes that we have been witnessing and what that may mean for how society needs to organize itself differently. So this is what Otto Scharmer came up with, what he calls Theory U. And basically this is how do you start to change behavior such that you are able to affect change. And so it starts with co-initiating. So everything is kind of centered on this notion of co-creating. And one of the things that we really work on at Ashoka is this idea of getting rid of walls. So you have typically in a society, you might have a business sector, you could have a government sector, you could have what everyone calls here an NGO sector, or third sector, or social sector. In the US, we call it a nonprofit sector. Sorry, this is a total sidebar, but I always think this is so interesting. In the US, when the third sector started to really come to existence, everyone said, oh, well, they're not earning a profit, so they must be a non-profit. And I love in Europe, when this third sector started to arise, we'd say, oh, well, they're not really government, so they're non-government. So our orientation is very different around government or not government, or profit or non-profit. But in Ashoka, we don't like using the word not to describe what you are, so we actually call it organizations, social sector organizations or citizen sector organizations. Okay, that was a total sidebar, I couldn't help myself. So this, anyway, one of the things that we really promote is how do you co-create and form teams that aren't constrained to the walls of an institution or a sector, but can really be fluid, like a team of teams. And I think that's sort of where society is going. So what you were trying to get is to this point of co-evolving, and what it really boils down to is connecting to the source of your will. And so when you're able to really be present when you're talking to others and trying to influence each other, then you start to see people's behavior change. And so one of the themes of today is co-creating, and another theme is being present. So I was asking this yesterday to the group. On a typical day, so just average day, what percentage of your day would you say that you're really present in the moment? You're not multitasking, your mind's not in other directions, you're really present in the moment. So would you say it's maybe, more than 80% of your day? More than 50% of your day? Okay. More than 30% of your day? Less than 30% of your day? Okay, so be thinking about that, because keep in mind that this is entirely for you. And whether or not you end up going for a grant, or if you guys didn't even know that was a possibility before you arrived today, so, or maybe some of you did. But this is really your space for you, and the more present you are for each other and for yourself, I think the more you're going to get out of this. So we'll go back to that question later of how present you really have been today. So just to reinforce this point, Otto Scharmer says, the success of our actions as change makers does not depend on what we do or how we do it, but from the inner place from which we operate. And we'll talk a lot about passion, what you're passionate about, and how you take that passion and you apply it to a problem to create change. And so really, it's what the success of an entrepreneur has a lot to do with perseverance and grit and drive. And the more that it comes from within, the more you're able to build that resilience, the more you're able to embrace failure, the more successful you're going to be as an entrepreneur. Okay, so I was talking about how society, we think, will start to evolve. And what Otto Scharmer talks about is that there are kind of 4 levels of society. So society 1.0 is very hierarchical, very command and control. You can think of the colonial system, you can think of the feudal system in Europe, where it's very top down, up until probably around the French Revolution. There were very few people who read, right? I'm sure this was the same in Zimbabwe. Now there's a very high literacy rate, but you can imagine in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, there were only a few people who knew how to read, and so they controlled everything. And everybody else just worked the land and basically did what they were told. They weren't really able to have their own ideas. And so that's a very top-down, very hierarchical society. But then when we started to see kind of more of a free market, and when the society started to open and people could access knowledge and literacy, then you started to see some entrepreneurship, some innovation, and that started to create wealth. And Society 3.0 was born out of seeing that there are a lot of negative externalities of a free market system. So child labor is one example, and environmental destruction is another. And so then you started to see this third sector, which we were talking about before, the social sector. And that's more kind of an interest group type sector, where people really care about one particular issue, and so they're really defending that issue. And then there's a lot of negotiating and sometimes lawsuits and that sort of thing. And so in many ways it's different sectors against each other. And so what we're starting to see a little bit of is this movement toward Society 4.0, which is more of a co-creating. So it's more cross-sector collaborating partnerships. It's teams that form across different players, different sectors, different teams. And so let's see how this actually can play out. So in Europe, I was talking before about the feudal system. And so before that, it was really kind of a free-for-all. And then in 1648, that was the 30 Years' War. Back a little bit in European history. And that's when so in Germany, for example, of what is now Germany today, there were something like 1,700 different kingdoms all across Germany. And so there was this territorial integration, and then some of the kings or the czars would be controlling this land and the people on that land, and it was very top-down hierarchical. So that was sort of 1.0 in Europe. And then we had the French Revolution, and we had the aftermath of that, and so we had these free markets start to rise. But then there was income growth, but there were all these negative externalities like child labor and that sort of thing. And so then we moved into this third sector, so we started to have environmental laws, child protection, consumer protection, and so forth. And now, after this financial meltdown that we had, and still kind of the aftermath in Europe, we're starting to see more cross-sector co-creation. So a couple examples of this is this slow food movement. Has anybody heard this before, slow food? So this is kind of a big European thing where it's the food industry is starting to change. It's starting to be more about, less about fast food and consumer packaged products like chips and ready-to-eat meals, and more about farmers and generally different players and different businesses starting to work together to bring more sort of local organic food back into the market. Social impact investing and socially responsible investing is kind of a big trend that's happening now. And in fact, so a couple people were talking about sanitation before. There is a huge fund that was created by Deutsche Bank in specifically investing in sanitation ideas. And we also worked with, I think it's Deutsche Bank again, with an eye care fund and other health-related funds. And they're for-profit investing, but all with an aim for social impact. So that's becoming a new trend, which is really exciting to see. There's the fair trade movement and then more conscious consuming movements. So these are all things where you're starting to see it's not one player versus another player as much anymore. It's starting to be more of a collaborative type trend. So you can see what it might look like in Africa. So yeah, there was colonial rule for quite a long time in many countries, except Ethiopia. They claim they've never colonized. So then, IMF played a big role, World Bank played a big role in Africa in developing these privatization and deregulation kind of approaches and more of a free market. Then we had the era of the NGOs. And so today, the question is this now the era for social entrepreneurs, social intrapreneurs, and social enterprise? So I'll quickly mention what those three things are. So who before today had really understood what social entrepreneur was? It sounded good, so you thought you'd come. Okay, well, it's pretty intuitive, but so an entrepreneur, the way we think about an entrepreneur is a person who introduces a new system or a new pattern in society, or they disrupt a system. So one example that we use is Florence Nightingale. Does anybody know Florence Nightingale, what she did? Go ahead. Who knows? Florence Nightingale, anyone?
Just in summary, I think she was working with, in the war, banding wounds and stuff. Then I think from there it grew up to be something big, which is probably now the nursing profession.
Yeah, pretty much we have the whole nursing profession. We have her to thank for the nursing profession. So that's a pretty big pattern that she introduced in society is nursing. So that's a social entrepreneur. A social intrapreneur is the same idea, except typically you're doing the entrepreneuring from inside an existing organization. I think a couple people talked about they work for a specific organization. Yes? Some people? Not your own company, but one that you're part of. So it's, in many ways, the life of a social entrepreneur is easier because you have all of these resources behind you. In other ways, it's a lot harder. Because you have all the culture and the structure and the could be bureaucracy, and your boss doesn't want you to do what you're doing, and all sorts of stuff that could be a challenge as a social entrepreneur. But that's kind of a new movement that we've been helping start as well as the social entrepreneurship movement. And then finally, social enterprise. So typically when you think of enterprise, you think of business, right? And so many social entrepreneurs start social enterprises, but not all. I mean, others may start a government program, or it could be technically a non-NGO or not-for-profit or citizen sector organization, as we would call it. So entrepreneur is really about introducing this new pattern in society, and you'll see some cool examples of that. Social enterprise is really the business that you start that has a social impact, but they're very related, as you can see. All clear? Clear as mud, clear as water. Water, more or less? Okay. So I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about sort of where the job market is going, because I think that's pretty relevant to this conversation as well. And this has been the work that I've been doing for the past year. So prior to this year, I was running an organization in a show called Youth Venture. And in Youth Venture, we've worked with about 10,000 teams of young people, about 200,000 young people together, who have started their own ventures. And what we found is that that skill set of starting and running your own venture is not only good in terms of the impact that you have with your venture, but it's also a really important skill set, in particular in 21st century kind of economy and society. And so a couple things that I think that'll make this more telling is this quote by an economist, Thomas Frey, that 60% of the best jobs in the next 10 years haven't been invented yet. So when you're thinking about going to college and getting your degree, that's kind of a scary thing to think, I don't even know what job's going to be there a couple of years from now. And one anecdote that I think is really interesting is computer science students, when they study computer science, what they're learning in their first year of college is obsolete by the time they get to their fourth year. So that's kind of just amazing, right? That as you're learning, you have to learn to learn. You have to learn to adapt because everything's changing so fast. And so, what used to be a career where you get a job and you work really hard on that job and then you get your watch and you retire, is not really the case anymore. You'll probably change career paths multiple times. And so, does everybody know LinkedIn? It's like Facebook, but that's a professional Facebook, and you put your resume up there. And I use LinkedIn all the time, by the way. It's really useful. Anyway, the founder of LinkedIn really believes in the importance of people being entrepreneurs, and that's kind of why he created LinkedIn in the first place, was it allowed people to build their own networks and to start kind of entrepreneuring their careers. And so one thing that he's known to say, and he wrote a whole book about this, is called The Startup of You. And he talks about how that same skill set of being an entrepreneur is exactly what you need in finding your career path and getting a job and being on your way in your career. So I thought that was really a profound idea. And so just to illustrate this a little bit more, this, by the way, as you're thinking about employing people, I think it's really useful to have this lens as well. At Ashoka, when we interview any candidate, the first thing that we look at is what is their track record as an entrepreneur. So that's sort of our knockout test. You're either an entrepreneur or you're not. And if you're not, you won't get a job at Ashoka. But if you are, then you will, possibly. And then we look at other criteria as well. But mostly around team skills, conceptual skills, and kind of your sense of what you can do in the world. But anyway, so this is an illustration of different skill types. This only goes to 98, but you can sort of see the trajectories. So everything that is routine is going way down. So there's not a whole lot of routine jobs that are contributing to the economy anymore. And so it's the non-routine jobs. Even the routine cognitive jobs are going way down. So it's not even just whether they're sort of professional or white-collar jobs versus blue-collar. It has a lot to do with whether it's routine or non-routine. So why do you think all of the routine jobs are going away?